Behind me is a picture of the dish of this decade, acai, something that took me hours of practice to be able to pronounce correctly. Okay, let's play a quick game. Raise your hand if you've seen acai before, perhaps on social media like TikTok or Instagram. Quite a few of you. Okay, and raise your hand if you would consider acai a more sustainable and healthy alternative to, say, a burger and fries. And lastly, raise your hand if you wouldn't mind indulging in a bowl of acai sometime soon. Me too. I was a victim to this acai trend just a few months ago. I mean, you're not just hearing it from me, but these receipts from takeaway orders speak for themselves. I was spending hundreds of dollars on acai every single month, literally going broke. And it isn't just me. The average consumer spends $20 per bowl of acai, contributing to the $1,482 million industry that acai has grown into this year. I mean, how couldn't one? It was just these berries, transformed into the sorbet, topped with your favorite fruits, packed with antioxidants, good for anxiety, tasty, trendy, and aesthetically pleasing. It was the perfect dish. But my approach to acai changed one day when I saw these pictures. This is the Amazon rainforest, or what's left of it today. Definitely less rainforest, more swamp and barren land. This is a landfill. It's where a third of the food that we produce each year ends up. You'll find it shocking that in a world where 10% of the population does not have access to their next meal, 33% of the food that we produce gets wasted. So let's come back to this bowl of acai for a second, and let's look at it from a different perspective that we perhaps didn't consider before. Let's ask a few questions that maybe we've never really thought of. Firstly, where do acai berries, which make the bowl, even come from? Secondly, how do we go from the acai berry to the acai bowl that we know today? And lastly, in this billion-dollar industry, where are the hundreds of dollars that I'm really spending going? Back in 2022, my friends and I asked these very questions in regards to Singapore's emerging market for food. And that's me at a farm as a part of our research. What we found was shocking. We realized that from seed to plate, at most points of production in our food systems, we see unethical and unsustainable business practices. We discovered the power that our wallets possess to push our economies to become more environmentally sustainable. Take the example of ugly food. Avocados, apples, limes, oranges. All kinds of fruit are thrown away by major supermarket chains in Singapore every single day. Why, you might ask? The answer is pretty simple. It's because they're ugly. To test this theory, I asked my grandmother whether she would buy a food that looks like this, and I was met with a very funny story. She told me about how when she was younger, it was a popular myth that if you were to buy jointed vegetables, you would go on to give birth to conjoined twins. And while this may seem extreme, it reveals a kind of implicit pretty privilege that exists in our society when it comes to purchasing food. I mean, I wouldn't want to spend my money on something that looks like this, even though it's perfectly safe to eat, but I don't mind spending a proportion of my income on food that looks like this. But wait a second, what does ugly food have to do with this beautiful bowl of acai, this picture of the Amazon rainforest, and this landfill full of food waste? To answer that question, let's introduce a business tool, the life cycle assessment. The life cycle assessment allows us to quantify the environmental impact of everyday business practices. It is divided into 5 stages, from the producer to the consumer. And in the case of acai, the first 2 stages are the most interesting: raw material extraction and assembly. Let's come back to a question that we asked earlier. Where do acai berries come from? You've probably guessed by now with the picture of the Amazon rainforest that, well, they come from Brazil, the Amazon rainforest. And you'd be right. You can see these thin and tall palm trees with branches of acai. And as acai exports increase over 14,000% every year, it's becoming increasingly common seeing workers endangering their lives, climbing up trees to pluck these acai berries. But we aren't just generating new land to meet this booming demand for acai. We are cutting down trees, and we are destroying the native and indigenous species that once existed in the Amazon. We are converting land that once housed over 70 different kinds of flora and fauna into virtual monocultures of acai. And this is just the very first stage of production. Acai, with its short shelf life of only 48 hours, must be transported from markets like this to industries like this to be processed using machinery. We can also consider the environmental cost of this express transport, but there is an added implication of processing the berry itself. This is the acai fruit as we know it, and this is the pulp. It's the part of the fruit that we actually use and makes up only about 5% of the total berry. This is what remains, 95%. Imagine a system where only 5% of the total input is actually useful. What happens to the remaining 95%? In the case of acai, it is thrown away. Thrown into the Amazon landfills, forming heaps of waste, or into our rivers, clogging up the waterways. This is just the initial stages of production of acai, and it goes without saying that the future stages of production also have their own environmental costs. For instance, acai needs to be flown from Brazil to all around the world. It is packaged into single-use plastic and must be stored in controlled temperatures. Not to mention all the fruits that get thrown away by major acai establishments every single day due to safety and health regulations. But this problem does not just exist for acai, but exists for most of the food that we consume every day. It reveals a larger systemic issue about our economy, the economy which prioritizes short-term gain over long-term sustainability. But who do we blame? Do we blame the farmers that do all in their means to provide for the next meal? Or do we blame the institutions that do their best to protect stakeholders' interests? Perhaps we can start by blaming ourselves, the consumer. Take a look at these advertisements. Smiling faces, health, wellness, organic, ethically sourced. In today's world, we are met with a relentless current, consumerism. Each day, the average individual sees over 10,000 advertisements, each an individually crafted narrative to convince you that their product can fill a void that has been created. But the only void being filled is our landfills. But here's the good news. We, the consumers, hold a lot of power, and it's about time that we recognize it. The solution to this may seem a little counterintuitive, because it's consumerism. Ethical consumerism. It's important that we consider that every purchase that we make is a vote. It's our way of telling businesses that this is what we want to see produced in our economy. We have the choice between being blind followers of trends or making informed decisions. But it isn't so easy to be an ethical consumer in the real world. And to explore that idea, we must consider consumer sovereignty versus consumer vulnerability. The idea that we can be an ethical consumer has the assumption that, well, consumers have information readily available to them. But in the real world, businesses hide their business practices that make them look in a bad light. Moreover, ethical consumerism's limitation is not just consumer vulnerability and the lack of information, but also the fact that it is an idea for the rich. A Canadian survey from 2018 finds that between shoppers that earn amongst $20,000 to $40,000, only 16.4% can be considered ethical consumers. For shoppers that earn more than $100,000, the number is almost 3 times at that. But ethical consumerism isn't impossible entirely, and it requires some action from us. So here's what we can do. We can research. Let's research into the businesses that we are supporting. What are their values? What is their corporate social responsibility? Are they transparent with their business practices? It is easy for businesses to slap on labels like sustainable, ethically sourced, and organic, but what do those really mean? And we must demand. We must demand the right products. We must demand things that we want to see produced in this economy. But our demand extends far from just the products that we consume, but also legislation. As put by the Food First Information and Action Network, there are too many gaps in international law which allow for the impunity of corporations that have caused or contributed to human rights loss and damage. In today's world, we see corporations jump between jurisdictions and evade justice. And it's just becoming easier to do so as there does not exist a standard framework for them to follow. While it may be argued that there is the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights, it is a work in progress, as it's voluntary and evidently it isn't working out. But the idea of legislation is not far from reality. In fact, we can already see the light at the end of the tunnel. For instance, we saw Volkswagen being fined billions of dollars over ethical concerns, HSBC being held accountable for greenwashing, and California's new law that can fine businesses up to $50,000 a day for improper plastic usage. Let's come back to this bowl of acai for the last time. And let's remind ourselves that it isn't just a trendy treat. It's not just a healthy breakfast. It tells us something about our economic systems that we just don't think about. And it tells us what we can do. When we demand things like acai, we demand the whole production cycle. We tell businesses that we're ready to buy our products, even though they come at an added environmental cost. Together, if we can choose wisely, we can demand better, and we can transform our food industry into somewhere where trendy doesn't mean unethical. Thank you.